an invasion by China, and using nuclear weapons early in a war against the United States. A recent leak of Russian secret documents has revealed Russian nuclear strategy and alarmed many at just how willing Putin is to use nuclear weapons. It's been widely known that Russia is a fading power, with the war in Ukraine exposing the rotten core of the Russian military. What's never before been revealed, however, is that Russia was aware to a degree of its own weakness and just how quickly it would rely on the use of nuclear weapons to balance out this weakness. Officially, Russian nuclear policy for decades included a no-first-use policy, meaning it would only use them to retaliate against another nuclear or weapon of mass destruction attack. Nuclear weapons would also be used if the existence of the Russian state itself was threatened. Then in 2020, Vladimir Putin did away with the no-first-use policy and expanded Russia's nuclear policy to include retaliation for wide-scale conventional attacks that caused critical damage to the Russian Federation. In a sense, modern Russia has a policy of escalating to de-escalate, using a nuclear weapon even against massive conventional attacks in order to de-escalate the conflict on terms favorable to itself. What few outside the Kremlin knew, however, was just how low the threshold for Russia's use of nuclear weapons really was. The leak of classified Russian documents includes 29 secret Russian military files drawn up between 2008 and 2014, and despite being 10 years old by this point, analysts believe that they are still highly relevant, especially in light of Russia's abysmal performance in Ukraine. The documents detail the use of tactical nuclear weapons rather than larger strategic weapons meant for use on large military bases or cities. These battlefield nukes, as they're often known, are significantly lower in yield than strategic weapons and often have been dialed up or down as necessary. Even so, they're still very powerful weapons of mass destruction. During the Cold War, the Western Allies envisioned the use of tactical nuclear weapons as a means of stopping the massive hordes of Soviet-blocked armored vehicles that would come pouring into Western Germany in case of war. The Soviets likewise saw tactical nuclear weapons as a way of leveling the playing field against increasingly sophisticated Western technology. Today, Russia's ever-weakening position on the international stage has created a degree of desperation and self-awareness over just how non-competitive the Russian military is against its traditional rival, the United States of America. After Desert Storm, Soviet military planners were thrown into a panic. At the time, Iraq had one of the largest militaries in the world and an extremely robust Soviet-built air defense network. Watching it get picked apart over a matter of weeks, as well as the collapse of Iraqi forces in Soviet tanks and infantry fighting vehicles against superior American equipment, sent a shockwave through the Kremlin and immediately prompted the reworking of war plans in case of a confrontation against NATO. It was clear that the only way to stop an American armored thrust was with nuclear weapons. As Russia emerged from the wreckage of the Soviet collapse, the gap between itself and the US and its allies only widened. The second US-led invasion of Iraq would once more send alarm bells ringing off throughout the Kremlin. The American contingent of 130,000 initial troops was inside of Washington even considered to be suicidal against the numerically superior Iraqi army. Yet lower-level commanders and analysts calling for more forces had significantly underestimated the massive force multipliers that the US had developed in just 10 years after Desert Storm. Up against an estimated 500,000 troops, 4,000 tanks, and 3,700 armored vehicles, the US suffered just 139 killed and 551 wounded, versus Iraq's up to 45,000 KIA. Once more, the Kremlin realized it was completely and utterly outmatched by the US's far superior conventional power. To rectify this, the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons would have to be significantly lowered, or else the Russian Federation would swiftly collapse in the face of a NATO attack. But the leaked documents also show that it wasn't just the US and its NATO allies that Russia was worried about, but also its very large and increasingly powerful southern neighbor in Asia. Even as Putin was attempting to forge closer ties with China, the secret leak of documents show that the Kremlin was increasingly paranoid about a Chinese invasion into Russia. Once more, nuclear weapons would be the first line of defense. And there's good reason for Russia to fear an attack by China. Despite seemingly warm relations between the two, before the war in Ukraine, Russia and China jointly declared a no-limits friendship. But when Russia invaded Ukraine just weeks later and began to lose badly, China was very quick to show that there were indeed firm limits in their friendship. On February 25, 2022, China abstained from a UN Security Council vote denouncing the invasion. And again on March 2nd, the nation abstained from a General Assembly vote condemning Russian aggression and demanding the withdrawal of its troops. Since then, China has walked a fine line between not being alienated internationally by supporting Russia and ensuring the Russian war effort doesn't completely collapse into disaster. Even so, China has a vested interest in the Russian state itself collapsing. Emerging from its century of humiliation, China is now looking back in time and finding ways of addressing past wrongs against it by European powers. Between 1858 and 1860, the Russian Empire annexed vast swaths of Chinese territory by forcing treaties upon the weaker Chinese state. Initially, China refused to agree to the demands, but its loss of the Second Opium War forced it to affirm the Russian annexation of territories known as Outer Manchuria. This move cut China off from the Sea of Japan while opening up warm water ports for the Russian Federation, and the territory itself has proven to be resource-rich. China has not forgotten the humiliation of the treaties forced upon it. And in 2023, the official Chinese map-making agency released new maps with Chinese names for the annexed territories instead of the Russian ones. It's not just a matter of bluff and bluster, though. Russia's very grip on its Far East territory is weakening. The ethnic Russian population has been decreasing year over year, and an estimated 6 million Russians in the territory face nearly 40 million Chinese directly across the border. The Chinese investments in the region are rapidly outpacing Russian investments, a situation compounded by Russia's weakening budget and the exodus of Western capital from Russia. With no other choice, Russia was forced to attempt to replace European and American investments with Chinese money. Yet many in China are seeing this as an opportunity to renegotiate the territorial settlement of 1994 that officially ended sovereignty disputes between the two nations. As has been commonly put by Chinese commentators, why should Chinese money go to develop stolen Chinese land on behalf of Russia? The leaked documents show just how paranoid Russia has become over a Chinese incursion into the region. The documents included training materials for the Eastern Russian military district to fight off a Chinese invasion, with multiple different scenarios highlighted. Per the various scenarios included in the documents, if the Russian military failed to defeat the initial invasion force, then local commanders were called to use tactical nuclear weapons against second-echelon Chinese forces in order to stop them in their tracks. What is unknown is if these nuclear strikes would take place once Chinese forces crossed the border or on Chinese soil itself, a difference which could dramatically escalate an exchange of tactical nuclear weapons into a full-scale strategic exchange. After the leaks of the documents, the Chinese Foreign Ministry denied that there were any tensions or hostilities between itself and Russia, stating, quote, "The Treaty of Good Neighborliness, Friendship, and Cooperation between China and Russia has legally established the concept of eternal friendship and non-enmity between the two countries." And yet, despite this, not only has China refused to provide badly needed military aid to Russia, on May 18, 2023, the same day as the meeting of the G7 in Hiroshima, China hosted its inaugural China-Central Asia Summit, inviting leaders from 5 Central Asian nations to attend. These 5 nations, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan, were all former Soviet republics and nations that Russia has historically seen as under its sphere of influence. On May 18th, Russia was humiliated by being left out of both the G7 and a meeting headed by China of its former Soviet territories. And this was not an accident, as China has increasingly expanded its influence into Central Asia and works to dislodge Russia as the dominant power in the region. Chinese investments in the region skyrocketed to $70 billion by 2022, and Russia's regional trade is less than 2/3 of China's own trade with Central Asia. However, the insecurity of the Russian military expands past just China, forecasting the dire situation it would find itself in if it had to go to war against a major conventional power, either China or the US. The documents also spelled out specific battlefield defeat conditions that would trigger the use of nuclear weapons. One of these conditions was the successful amphibious landing of an enemy force upon the Russian mainland. The Russian Far East is difficult to defend given its vast expanses and how vulnerable Russian logistics are for actually getting troops into the region. The scenario is likely aimed squarely at the US, as it's incredibly likely that in the case of a full-scale war between itself and the US, the American Marine Corps would launch an amphibious assault on Fulkino, headquarters of Russia's Pacific Fleet, and Vladivostok itself. While Russia has rail connections to rapidly move troops and equipment from its western military districts to the area, there is little hope that it would be able to protect those railways from American air and missile attack, leaving its Far East forces stranded against superior US firepower. In such a dire scenario, the use of nuclear weapons would be the only way to dislodge the American invasion force. A second prompt for the use of nuclear weapons would be the defeat of Russian border defenses. Similar to fears of a Chinese penetration, the doctrine calls for the use of nuclear weapons should an enemy force successfully penetrate into Russia, with nuclear weapons used to significantly attrit follow-on forces and prevent a catastrophic breakthrough. The world saw just how poorly Russia is suited to respond to enemy breakthroughs in the fall of 2022 counteroffensive by Ukraine, which saw the nation retake vast swaths of occupied territory in a matter of weeks. The stunning counteroffensive was possible due to the use of misdirection on the Ukrainians' behalf, but also because the Russian military had failed to spot and identify a buildup of Ukrainian forces and respond quickly while under fire to a rapidly evolving breakthrough. How a nation with an air force the size of Russia's was unable to prevent such a catastrophic collapse of the front lines remains a mystery, but it is indicative of the overall weakness of the Russian military. Another trigger for the escalation of the use of nukes is the loss of 20% of Russia's ballistic missile submarines or 30% of its attack submarines. Both of these make sense, as Russia would rely on its attack submarines to try to prevent the US from reinforcing Europe in case of war, or to interdict an invasion of its Pacific coast. The loss of its undersea portion of the nuclear triad is likewise an alarming proposition for Russia, given the fact that there is practically zero chance a Russian nuclear bomber would ever successfully deliver its payload to an American city. With US ballistic missile defenses becoming increasingly powerful over time, the efficacy of Russia's ballistic missile forces is also in serious question. Submarines, however, allow for the launching of weapons closer to enemy shores and from unpredictable locations, making interception very unlikely. The loss of its ballistic missile submarines would thus potentially leave Russia vulnerable to a catastrophic nuclear attack it could not successfully deter or retaliate against. More worryingly, though, is just how fast Russia is willing to use nuclear weapons in even far lower stakes scenarios. The loss of just 3 of its cruisers, 3 airfields, or a simultaneous attack on its main and reserve coastal command centers would all trigger a nuclear response. This is worrying because there is little doubt that the US or even China would promptly sink any Russian ship foolish enough to leave the safety of shore-based air and missile defenses. And given that Russia has already lost 1 cruiser to Ukraine, this specific threshold is incredibly low. Likewise is the loss of 3 airfields to enemy attack. The United States or China would inevitably target Russian airfields in order to ground its air force. Although given just how many Russian aircraft have been shot down by Russian air defenses in Ukraine and within Russia, it might just be better if they simply allowed Russia to operate its airfields unharassed. The documents also outline various options for the use of nuclear weapons by commanders in order to avert battlefield defeat or to enhance the effectiveness of the Russian Navy. The latter is likely aimed at destroying the US and Chinese carriers, which pose a significant threat to the Russian Navy and which it's poorly suited for countering at the moment. Overall, though, the document itself insinuates the use of nuclear blackmail by Russia in order to gain a degree of freedom in its actions. One of NATO's chief concerns has been a fait accompli attack against the Baltic states. In such an attack, Russia would launch an attack into one or more of the Baltic states and either seize a small amount of territory or attempt to take their capitals, which most analysts predict the nation should be able to do before NATO firepower descends on the region, at least prior to the joining of Finland and Sweden into the alliance. Such an attack would throw NATO into deliberation over the implementation of Article 5, over territory that some NATO states, such as Turkey or a United States under the leadership of someone like former President Trump, may not see as worth living up to treaty obligations over. At the first sign of a major defeat, Russia would rapidly escalate in order to de-escalate in its favor. This would involve the sudden use of tactical nuclear weapons or multiple, either directly on NATO forces or in close proximity to them, causing low damage but testing the resolve of the alliance. NATO would then be forced into one of 2 options: allow Russia to use battlefield nuclear weapons while sticking to only conventional weapons, or simply acquiesce to Russian demands and allow it to hold territory it took from NATO. In effect, Russia would be using nuclear weapons to blackmail other nations and give itself the freedom to do as it pleases, as long as it picks a fight it can win quickly and then go on the defensive. This reckless ideology is not only inherently dangerous, but dangerous because it encourages similar behavior from other nuclear states, such as North Korea, or perhaps even India and Pakistan, should their historical feud heat up once again. The world would then see a nuclear arms race on a truly global scale. and it would become obvious to all that the only way to ensure one's safety is to have nukes of your own. In short, Russia's reckless nuclear policy is not just dangerous to enemies, but for the entire world. Modern Russia, in a very real sense, has become the kid on the block who runs his mouth, can't back it up, gets punched in the face, and then comes back later with a gun. The reveal of the secret documents has thrown into question the West's proper reaction to Russia's aggression in Ukraine, given how low the nation's threshold for the use of nuclear weapons is. Yet, at this inflection point, it's even more dangerous for the West to not react and therefore set a precedent for nuclear blackmail. Such a failure to stand up to Russian aggression would only encourage more aggression down the line, and should Ukraine fall, Europe will find itself with the largest, most experienced army on the continent at its doorstep, and a Russian economy fully mobilized for war. Now go check out US Congressman warns of new Russian doomsday weapon, or click this other video instead.